In Regency England, a debt was not merely a financial inconvenience, it was a sentence. Not the dramatic sentence of debtor's prison, though that particular humiliation awaited those without daughters to barter, but the quieter, more surgical sentence of a family reduced to its most negotiable asset, a girl, her age, her name, her future, folded neatly into a contract and exchanged across a solicitor's desk like a deed to failing land. The Duke of Blackpool is mad. Everyone said so. No one had survived close enough proximity to prove otherwise. But proof, in the economy of whispers that governed polite society, was never truly the requirement. The requirement was the story. The requirement was the way his name emptied a room, the way mothers steered daughters to the far wall at assemblies, the way even the most seasoned gossips dropped their voices when they described the things that allegedly happened behind the iron gates of Blackpool Manor. Violence, isolation, a man so thoroughly broken by whatever catastrophe had claimed his sanity that his estate had become less a home than a monument to ruin. And into this monument steps Bethany Leach, 18 years old, too educated for drawing rooms, too precise for parlors, too relentlessly inconveniently analytical for a society that required its women soft and its silences unquestioned. Her family has run through patience and through options with equal efficiency. The Duke of Blackpool has made an offer. No one else has. The mathematics, therefore, are simple. She has heard every story. She has catalogued them, the tremors, the screaming, the servants who flee and never explain why. She has assembled from these fragments a working theory of the worst possible outcome and found it, upon examination, survivable. Fear, in her experience, was simply data one had not yet organized. She has organized it. She is prepared. She is wrong about nearly everything. Because on the night of their wedding, in a room where a single lamp burns against the dark, the Duke of Blackpool sits across from his new bride at a distance that is precise and deliberate, and begins to speak, not the legend society constructed to contain him, not the madness his enemies have cultivated like a crop, the truth, offered plainly, without theater, to the only person he has chosen to trust with it, a woman sold to him specifically because the world considered her mind a defect. Bethany Leach, who believed she had already diagnosed the worst her world could produce, discovers that she has made a critical error in her calculations. The Duke is not mad. He is in pain. And that, a brilliant, suffering, desperately rational man who chose her when no one else would, is the most dangerous variable she never thought to account for. The wedding guests had not celebrated. Bethany had noticed this with the detached precision that had always made her unsuitable for polite company. They had attended, filling the cold pews of St. Augustine's in their careful finery, watching the ceremony with the particular expression people reserved for public executions, fascinated, repelled, grateful it was not them. The Duke of Blackpool had stood at the altar like a man carved from consequence, dark-coated, broad-shouldered, with a jaw set so hard it appeared structural rather than anatomical. There were faint marks on his face that no one in the church was polite enough to stop staring at. Bethany had catalogued those, too. Old scarring along the cheekbone, a recent abrasion near the temple, a man who collided with the world regularly, or a man the world regularly collided with. She had cried during the ceremony. She was not ashamed of this. Tears, she had long ago decided, were simply the body's most efficient pressure-release mechanism. They meant nothing about weakness and everything about accurate self-assessment. She was being sold. Her body understood this, even when her mind was busy organizing it into something manageable. He had not looked at her once. Blackpool Manor arrived in the dark, which she suspected was intentional. One could not fully absorb a Gothic monstrosity in daylight. The eye needed shadow, needed the way the iron gates groaned with genuine structural suffering, needed the torchlight throwing the Manor's face into sharp relief before swallowing it again. It was enormous. It was cold. It smelled of beeswax and old paper, and something else beneath both, something mineral and sharp that she could not yet classify. The staff received them in near silence. No celebration, no flowers. A housekeeper named Mrs. Aldrin, who moved with the careful economy of a woman long accustomed to keeping a household's secrets, and said only, "His Grace will see you in the study, Miss Your Grace." The correction landed quietly, as if she had not yet earned the title, as if it remained to be determined whether she would. She was shown to the study alone. He was standing at the window when she entered, not facing it. That would have suggested contemplation, and nothing about the Duke of Blackpool suggested anything so passive. He was positioned beside it, one hand braced against the stone wall above the frame, as though the wall required his personal supervision to remain upright, or as though he required the wall. He did not turn immediately. When he did, it was with the measured deliberateness of a man who had learned to make every physical movement a decision rather than a reflex. "Sit down," he said, not unkindly, simply directly. "I prefer to stand." Something shifted in his expression, not anger, something she could not immediately categorize, which was itself unusual enough to be notable. "So do I," he said, "usually. Tonight I'm going to need you to extend me the professional courtesy of ignoring that preference." He sat, and she saw, then, why. The tremor began in his right hand. It was not violent, nothing so crude as convulsion. It was precise and terrible, a fine, relentless shaking that traveled from his fingers up through the wrist and terminated somewhere in the forearm before he pressed the hand flat against his thigh and held it there with the concentrated force of a man pinning something dangerous to the floor. His jaw tightened, a muscle in his temple flickered, and then, over the course of approximately 30 seconds that Bethany did not breathe through, the tremor subsided. He looked up at her. "That," he said, "is what I am." He spoke for a long time. She did not interrupt. This, she would later reflect, was perhaps the first genuinely useful thing she had ever done in a social situation. Lewis Ashford, the 8th Duke of Blackpool, spoke with the flat precision of a man who had rehearsed truth so many times in solitude that it had lost its softness entirely. The neurological episodes had begun 6 years prior. They were progressive. They were triggered by sound, by light, by the specific sensory assault of crowds, of music, of the ordinary noise of a world that did not accommodate men who were constructed differently. He had no diagnosis that satisfied him. He had physicians who were either incompetent or corruptible, and he had learned, with some difficulty, to distinguish between the two. The madness, he explained, was a policy decision, a calculated fiction maintained at considerable personal cost that had successfully kept predators at bay for 4 years. His cousin Bradley Norman had been circling the Blackpool fortune since Lewis's father's death. A mad duke could be committed. A mad duke's assets could be managed. A mad duke was a problem with a solution that happened to benefit the right people enormously. "And now," said Bethany quietly, when he finally stopped speaking, "you have a wife." "He have you," he said. The distinction in his voice was unmistakable. "I chose you with some specificity, Miss Leach. Your reputation for being unmalleable, undeceivable. Your family confirmed you had read every medical volume in their library and most of what the lending house carried." She looked at him for a long moment. "You don't need a wife," she said. "You need a partner." The Duke of Blackpool met her eyes for the first time since the altar. "Yes," he said simply, "I do." She began with the curtains. This was not, on its surface, a revolutionary act. Curtains were changed in households across England every season, a domestic ritual as unremarkable as the rotation of menus or the replacement of worn rugs. But the curtains at Blackpool Manor had not been changed in 6 years, and the particular quality of light they admitted, thin, unpredictable, slicing through gaps in the heavy brocade at angles that shifted with the hour, was, she had determined within her first 48 hours of residency, a primary aggravant to Lewis's sensory episodes. She replaced them with wool, dense, undyed, grey, curtains that did not perform, curtains that simply worked. Mrs. Aldrin had watched this first modification with an expression Bethany was learning to read as the housekeeper's version of profound emotional conflict, a tightening round the eyes, a carefully maintained neutrality of mouth, the specific posture of a woman who had opinions she had not yet decided were safe to express. By the third day, when Bethany had also removed the decorative brass clock from the study, its irregular ticking had been producing precisely the kind of unpredictable auditory interference she needed eliminated. Mrs. Aldrin had arrived at a conclusion. "The village is saying your Brace practices dark arts," she offered, in the tone of someone delivering weather information. "The village," said Bethany, without looking up from the estate ledger she was cross-referencing against Lewis's medical notes, "may occupy itself however it finds most satisfying." The manor, she discovered, had been suffering from the same thing as its master, neglect dressed as mystery. Every closed door she opened revealed not horror but disorder, rooms accumulated with the artifacts of a man who had been managing crisis for so long that management had become the whole of his existence. There were stacks of correspondence, unopened, organized only by how recently they had arrived. Financial ledgers maintained in 3 different hands across 4 different systems, none of them speaking to the others. A library of extraordinary depth and total chaos. Books pulled from shelves and left horizontal, vertical, diagonal, open to pages that mattered urgently at some point and never been returned to. She began with the correspondence, then the ledgers, then finally the library, which she reorganized not alphabetically as convention demanded, but by subject proximity. Medical texts beside natural philosophy, agricultural theory beside economic history, the organization of a mind that moved associatively rather than sequentially, because she was building this library for Lewis's use, not her own comfort. He found her there on the 4th evening, standing on the library ladder with an annotated volume of neurological case studies she had located behind 3 years of unread parliamentary reports. He looked at the shelves. He looked at her. He said nothing for a long moment. "You moved the Blackstone," he said, finally. "It was shelved under law. You never approached that section. I moved it beside the medical texts because the 3rd volume contains the most comprehensive early documentation of tremor disorders I have found in this collection."
Another silence. She had learned already that his silences were not absences of thought. They were thought made visible. "You read the annotations," he said. "I read everything." He looked at the shelves again, and she watched something in his posture, that perpetual structural bracing she had catalogued on their wedding night, ease by a fraction so small she suspected he was unaware of it. "The morning room," he said, "the east-facing windows. At 10 o'clock the light is tolerable." "I know," she said. "I've been working in there." She codified everything. This was not sentiment, it was science, applied to architecture, to schedule, to the management of a human being's daily existence with the same methodical rigor one would apply to any complex system under threat. She noted that the dinner hour produced more episodes than the afternoon. The combination of candlelight proximity and silverware noise, she theorized, creating a compound sensory load that exceeded his threshold. She moved dinner back an hour and replaced the silver table settings nearest his position with pewter, which rang flatter when touched. She noted that certain rooms in the manor's east wing amplified sound due to bare stone walls and high ceilings, and arranged for the hanging of tapestries that had been in storage since Lewis's father's tenure, thick Flemish wool that absorbed rather than reflected, deadening the echo into something habitable. She noted that he worked best between the hours of 4 and 7 in the morning, when the house was entirely silent, and arranged with Mrs. Aldrin that no staff movement occur in the corridors adjacent to his study during those hours, framing it simply as the Duke's preferred schedule, which it was. The village decided she was performing rituals. Neighboring estates, whose occupants had expected the new Duchess of Blackpool to arrive in distress and depart by summer, began receiving reports from their servants, who had it from the Blackpool staff, that the young Duchess had covered the windows with something resembling burial cloth, removed every clock she could locate, and was conducting what appeared to be experiments in the library. Bethany received this intelligence on a Tuesday morning and found it, upon brief reflection, entirely acceptable. Let them theorize, let them whisper their comfortable fictions. She had work to do. And for the first time in the 6-year history of Blackpool Manor's misery, so did its Duke.
It began with a disagreement about crop rotation. This was not, Bethany reflected later, the most romantic origin for a partnership, but romance had never been the working vocabulary between them, and she had come to suspect that Lewis Ashford was constitutionally incapable of approaching any subject, including, perhaps especially, human connection, without first subjecting it to rigorous examination. Sentiment without evidence was, in his personal epistemology, simply noise, and noise, for Lewis, was a problem with measurable consequences. The ledgers had revealed, over the course of her second week at Blackpool Manor, that the estate's agricultural holdings were failing with quiet, systematic efficiency. Not dramatically, no single catastrophic season, no obvious mismanagement that could be corrected with a single decision, something more insidious, a gradual exhaustion of the soil across the northern fields, compounded by a tenancy arrangement that had not been renegotiated in 11 years, and now bore no relationship whatsoever to current yields or current costs. The estate was not collapsing, it was dissolving, slowly, politely, in the manner of things that have been neglected so long they have forgotten how to demand attention. She brought the ledgers to the study at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning and laid them open across his desk without preamble. "Your northern fields are being farmed to death," she said. "The yield records for the past 6 seasons show a 17% decline that your current steward has been compensating for by underreporting acreage to the London accounts. He is not stealing, he is protecting himself from a conversation he does not know how to have with you." Lewis looked at the ledgers, then at her. "And your recommendation?" "Fallow rotation on the northern third, beginning next spring. Renegotiate the tenancy agreements using the Holcomb model. I found a complete account of it in your library, third shelf from the window, between the Geological Survey and the Virgil. Your soil composition in that section is close enough that the methodology should transfer with modification." He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the desk, turned the ledger toward himself, and began reading. Not skimming, reading, with the focused, consumptive attention of a man for whom information was both sustenance and armor. "The Holcomb model requires capital investment in the first year," he said without looking up. "Yes, approximately £400 against a projected recovery of income within 3 seasons. You've calculated this. I've calculated this." He turned another page. "Your figures assume cooperative tenants. My figures assume tenants who are currently watching their own yields decline and therefore will find cooperation rationally preferable to the alternative." She paused. "I'd like to meet with them." Lewis looked up then. The expression was not surprise, precisely. She was coming to understand that he did not experience surprise so much as rapid recalibration. You want to conduct the tenancy negotiations. You large gatherings difficult to manage. I find them merely tedious. She held his gaze steadily. This seems like an efficient allocation of our respective tolerances. He did not agree immediately. She had not expected him to. But 3 days later he placed on her desk a complete summary of every tenancy arrangement on the Blackpool estate, annotated in his precise, architectural hand, with specific notes on which tenants held grievances, which held goodwill, and which were the informal opinion leaders whose positions would determine the disposition of the rest. It was, she recognized immediately, intelligence of the highest practical order, the accumulated social observation of a man who could not tolerate crowds, but had spent years watching them from a careful distance, cataloguing their internal politics with the dispassion of a naturalist recording animal behavior. She read every word. Then she wrote her questions in the margin and left it on his desk before he was awake. She found it returned to her desk by noon, every question answered. This became their language. Not conversation exactly, not the easy domestic exchange that she imagined occurred in ordinary marriages between ordinary people. Something more precise than that, and in its precision more intimate. Documents passed between desks with marginalia that gradually, over the weeks of that autumn, expanded beyond the purely functional. His annotations began to include context she had not requested, but found invaluable. The history behind a decision, the logic beneath a number, the specific way a problem had resisted solution, and why. Her responses began to include, almost without her noticing, the reasoning behind her own conclusions, not just what she had determined, but how, the machinery of her thinking made visible. He read it all. She knew this because his counter-annotations engaged not merely with her conclusions, but with her methods, questioning an assumption here, extending a line of reasoning there, occasionally and without fanfare, arriving at a refinement of her original position that was simply, objectively, more correct. She found this, to her own considerable surprise, deeply satisfying. It was not what she had expected to find in a marriage. She had expected endurance. She had expected the management of proximity with a stranger. She had constructed, from the materials available, something functional, if not comfortable. She had not expected to be challenged, to lay an idea down before another mind and find it returned to her improved, not diminished, not dismissed, not redirected towards something more decorative and less inconvenient, but built upon. Outside Blackpool Manor, the village continued its quiet theories. Inside it, two people who had each been discarded for the crime of thinking too precisely were, with great care and considerable mutual suspicion, beginning to build something neither had a name for yet. She had been preparing for it. This was not pessimism. It was the logical extension of everything she had observed in the 6 weeks since her arrival at Blackpool Manor. The careful mapping of Lewis's thresholds, the documentation of triggers, the quiet architecture of avoidance she had been constructing around his daily existence with the methodical patience of someone who understood that prevention and cure were not the same discipline. Prevention she could engineer. Cure remained, for now, outside the boundaries of what either of them could honestly claim to know. But preparation was not the same as readiness. She understood this distinction the night the storm arrived. It began with the weather, which was almost insultingly literal. A November gale had been building across the coast since midday, the kind that arrived in stages, first as a pressure change that she noticed in the quality of the manor's silence, then as wind against the west-facing windows, then as something that moved through the old stone of the building itself, a low, irregular vibration that she felt more in the chest than the ears. She had been in the library when the first shutter came loose on the upper floor. The crack of it against the exterior wall was sudden and total, the kind of sound that existed for a fraction of a second before the body had time to brace against it. She was already moving toward the study when she heard the second shutter, and the third. She found Louis standing in the center of the study with both hands pressed flat against the surface of his desk, head lowered, breathing with the deliberate mechanical regularity of a man who had reduced himself to a single operational priority. The lamp nearest the window was throwing irregular light, the gale was affecting the flame, and the combined sensory assault of unpredictable sound and unpredictable light and the vibration still moving through the walls was visible in him the way structural stress is visible in a bridge, not collapse, not yet, the precise terrible moment before. The tremor in his right hand had already spread to his left. Louis, she kept her voice flat. No alarm, no softness. Softness, she had theorized, would be another thing to process, and he was already at capacity. She needed to be a signal, not additional noise. The desk is solid. The floor is solid. The walls have been standing since 1703, and the gale does not change that. What you are hearing is exterior. You are interior. Separate those two things. His breathing hitched, then resumed. She noted the interval. "The lamp," she said. "Don't look at it. Look at the desk." A long moment. The wind screamed against the west wall. Another shutter. She counted them now, filing them, stripping them of their capacity to surprise by making them expected, sequential, documented. And Louis's hands pressed harder against the mahogany, and she watched the tremor in his right hand reach its apex and begin, fractionally, to recede. It took 11 minutes. She counted those, too. When it was over, he did not move for some time. She did not prompt him. She crossed to the window and addressed the lamp, adjusting the wick until the flame burned steady and low, removing the variable. And then she sat in the chair across from his desk and opened the notebook she had carried in with her and wrote down everything she had observed. Onset conditions, duration, progression, the specific sequence of sensory inputs and their apparent relative weight, the interventions she had attempted and her assessment of their effectiveness. She wrote for several minutes before she became aware that he was watching her. "You're documenting it," he said. His voice was rough at the edges. The aftermath, she had noted previously, left him sounding like a man who had been somewhere difficult and made the return journey on foot. "Yes, you were—" He stopped, recalibrated. "You were talking to me and filing observations simultaneously. Correct." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face that she was not yet fluent enough in his expressions to name with confidence. "Most people leave the room," he said. "I'm aware." She finished her notation and closed the notebook and did not look up and did not elaborate and understood from the quality of the silence that followed that he had heard everything she had not said.
Bradley Norman arrived on a Thursday, which Bethany would later identify as tactically significant. Thursday was market day in the village. The Blackpool staff was reduced by a third. Mrs. Aldrin's standing arrangement with the local merchants required her physical presence, and the house ran on a skeleton of junior staff who were competent at their specific tasks and entirely unequipped for anything outside them. It was not the day one chose for a courtesy call. It was the day one chose when the objective was to find a household with its guard lowered and its most observant occupants occupied elsewhere. She had been in the library when she heard the carriage on the drive. He was not what she had expected. This was, she acknowledged privately, a recurring condition of her life at Blackpool Manor, the persistent insufficiency of her expectations against the reality of what the house kept producing. She had constructed Bradley Norman from the fragments Louis had provided during their late-night working sessions, a man of appetites, of financial anxiety dressed as family concern, of the particular social fluency that mistook performance for substance. She had expected something obviously predatory, something one could identify and categorize efficiently.
Bradley Norman was handsome. This was the first inconvenience. He was perhaps 35, broad-shouldered in a way that suggested former athleticism, now softened with comfort, with a face arranged in an expression of such warm, practiced concern that she spent the first 30 seconds of their introduction examining it for the seams. "Cousin," he said to Lewis, who had appeared in the entrance hall with the controlled deliberateness she had come to recognize as his public architecture, every movement pre-decided, every variable accounted for, the whole apparatus of his physical presence deployed as a kind of argument against the rumors that followed his name. "I hope this visit is not an imposition. I find I cannot stay away when I think of how long it has been." Lewis said nothing. He was, she had learned, economical with words in proportion to how little he trusted their recipient. Bradley's gaze moved to her with an ease that was itself a form of assessment, the practiced social glide of a man who had learned to evaluate rooms and their contents in a single sweep. "And this must be the Duchess," he smiled. It reached his eyes with suspicious precision. "I confess I was astonished by the news of the marriage. Lewis, you sly creature, you said nothing." "I rarely do," Lewis said. She watched him throughout the afternoon. This was not difficult, as Bradley Norman was a man who rewarded observation. He moved through Blackpool Manor with a familiarity that slightly exceeded what courtesy visits warranted, pausing in doorways a half-second longer than necessary, glancing at modifications she had made to the interior with an attention that he dressed as idle curiosity, but which she recognized as inventory. He noted the curtains, he noted the absence of the brass clocks, he noted the rearranged library, and in the library he paused longest, his gaze traveling the shelves with an expression she could not immediately classify. At dinner, which she had arranged at the modified hour in the modified configuration, all of it invisible to anyone who did not know what they were looking at, Bradley was charming in the way of men who have learned that charm is a more efficient instrument than force. He asked Lewis about the estate with the careful solicitude of a man performing concern. He asked Bethany about her family with the careful solicitude of a man performing interest. "You were quite the scholar, I understand," he said pleasantly. "Lewis has always appreciated an unusual mind." She looked at him across the table. "Has he?" "Oh, certainly." Bradley lifted his glass. "Though I confess it must be quite an adjustment. Blackpool Manor is—" He paused, performing a delicate search for the right word with rather too much theatrical effort. "Demanding in its particular way." "I find it suits me," she said. "Remarkable." The word landed softly, with a precision she did not miss. "You must have remarkable fortitude." What he was doing, she understood, was building a record, each pleasant, concerned inquiry about the difficulty of managing Blackpool Manor, each solicitous observation about the unusual nature of the household, each carefully worded expression of familial worry about Lewis's condition. Each of these was a brick in a construction that would, when sufficient bricks had been assembled, constitute testimony, the portrait of a troubled estate, an erratic duke, a young wife managing a situation that exceeded reasonable expectation. She filed every word. He left before dark. The carriage disappeared down the Blackpool Drive with a promptness that confirmed the visit had accomplished its purpose. Lewis stood at the window of the study and watched until the sound of wheels on gravel had faded entirely. Then he said without turning, he counted the rooms. He counted the rooms, she confirmed, and the staff, and spent approximately 4 minutes in the east corridor where the sound modification is most visible. She paused. He brought a solicitors' clerk, the young man with the brown coat who waited with the carriage. I saw him writing in the drive. Lewis turned from the window. In the low light, his expression was the careful, stripped-down thing it became when he was past performance and into reality. "It begins, then," he said. "It began before today." She looked him steadily. "We're simply now aware of it, which is, strategically speaking, considerably better than the alternative." He held her gaze for a long moment. "You're not frightened?" "I'm constructing a response. There isn't room for both." She had always believed that the most radical act available to a woman in her world was documentation. Not protest, not defiance. Defiance was visible, and visibility invited suppression with an efficiency that Regency society had refined to near artistry. Documentation was quieter than that. Documentation was the long game. It was the difference between a grievance spoken into a drawing room and a grievance written into a ledger. The former dissipated on contact with indifference, the latter accumulated, compounded, became over time the kind of evidence that courts of law were constitutionally obligated to pretend they could not ignore. She began the journal the morning after Bradley Norman's visit. She chose the format with deliberate care. Not a diary, the word itself carried implications of sentiment, of subjectivity, of the feminine introspection that opposing counsel would use to dismiss its contents before the binding was fully examined. What she constructed instead was modeled on the clinical case notes she had studied in the medical texts from Lewis's library, the systematic, impersonal, dated record of observed phenomena that demanded engagement on its own terms because its terms were exclusively empirical. Each entry began with the date, the time, the weather conditions, and the barometric pressure as measured by the instrument she had requisitioned from the Manor's neglected meteorological equipment. She had formed a working hypothesis, still preliminary, requiring further observation, that certain combinations of pressure change and temperature shift were correlated with increased episode frequency. The data so far was suggestive. Within 3 weeks, she expected it to be conclusive. She recorded every episode with clinical precision, duration measured in minutes and seconds, laterality, whether the tremor originated in the right hand, the left, or presented bilaterally. Severity, assessed against a gradated scale she had developed herself, borrowing the framework from a naval surgeon's wound classification system she had found in the library's medical collection, and adapting it for neurological application. Trigger conditions, listed without editorial comment, specific sounds, light qualities, crowd sizes, specific combinations thereof. Recovery time. Post-episode cognitive function assessed through the quality of his written annotations on estate documents produced within 2 hours of each incident, a measure she was particularly proud of as it quantified something that opposing counsel would inevitably attempt to characterize as immeasurable. She recorded what he could do as rigorously as what he could not. This was not sentiment, it was strategy. A medical record that catalogued only deficits was a record that served Bradley Norman's purposes. A medical record that catalogued the precise, documented scope of Lewis Ashford's functioning intelligence, his analytical output, his decision-making clarity, his management of the estate's complex affairs during the same periods when his neurological condition was most active, was a different document entirely. It was the record of a man fully in possession of his faculties, navigating a physical condition with methodical competence. It was the record of a man who could not be committed. Lewis discovered the journal on a Tuesday. She had left it briefly on the library table while retrieving a reference volume, and returned to find him standing over it with an expression she had learned to read as the particular stillness that preceded either a significant question or a significant silence. He was reading the most recent entry. His right hand, she noted automatically, was steady. "This is dated 6 weeks back," he said. "From the day after your cousin's visit, though I incorporated retrospective observations from my notes for the preceding weeks." She set down the reference volume. "The earlier entries are less formally structured. I've been standardizing the methodology as my understanding of the condition improves." He turned back several pages, read, turned back further. She waited, watching him move through the accumulated record of himself with the focused, dispassionate attention he brought to everything, the estate ledgers, the agricultural surveys, her own marginal annotations on problems she had set before him. She had learned to read the quality of his silences, and this one was not the silence of offense or intrusion. It was the silence of a man encountering something he had not permitted himself to expect. He stopped at an entry from 3 weeks prior, the night of the second storm. She knew which observation had arrested him without needing to see the page. She had written the entries. She knew which ones contained more than data. Subject demonstrated sustained analytical function throughout and immediately following episode. Estate correspondence reviewed, annotated, and returned within 90 minutes of onset. Condition is neurological. Condition is not cognitive. These are not the same thing, and the distinction is the entire case. He closed the journal. He did not close it the way one closes a document one has finished with. He closed it the way one closes something that requires a moment before one knows what to say. "You wrote that it is the entire case," he said. "It is." He set the journal down on the table between them with a care that was not quite steadiness. Bethany, her name in his mouth, used directly, without the formality that had governed the early weeks of their arrangement, she noted this too, filed it somewhere that was not the clinical journal. "If this fails, it will not fail," she said. "It is a complete and dated medical record maintained by the Duchess of Blackpool, who happens to have read every relevant text in your library." She met his eyes. "Let Bradley Norman find a court that will dismiss that without consequences." The silence that followed was the particular quality she had come to recognize as Louis Ashford's version of gratitude. Too precise a man for easy expression, too honest a man to offer what he did not mean. She picked up her pen and opened the journal to a fresh page. There was still work to do. Dr. Elliot Tyler arrived with excellent references and a very small hesitation. Bethany noticed the hesitation first. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds, the interval between the moment Mrs. Aldrin announced him in the entrance hall and the moment he stepped across the threshold with his bag and his credentials and his expression of practiced medical authority. 2 seconds in which his eyes moved across the entrance hall with a swiftness that was not the curiosity of a man absorbing an unfamiliar environment, but the efficiency of a man confirming something he had already been told to expect. She noted it, said nothing, welcomed him with the composed civility of a duchess receiving a physician, and began immediately to pay attention. He had been recommended by letter from a Dr. Hargreaves of London, whose name Louis recognized as a member of the Royal College with a respectable publication record in neurological medicine. The letter itself was impeccable, warm without excess, professional without coldness, describing Tyler as a man of considerable clinical experience with particular interest in disorders of the nervous system. Louis had read it twice, which was his version of cautious optimism, and Bethany had read it 3 times, which was her version of preliminary suspicion. The letter was too well constructed. This was the problem. Genuine professional correspondence carried the minor inefficiencies of authentic authorship, the slightly redundant phrase, the compliment that went 1 clause longer than strictly necessary, the organizational logic of a man writing to a colleague rather than composing for an audience. Hargreaves' letter had none of these imperfections. It read like a document that had been drafted, reviewed, and refined until every sentence performed exactly its intended function. In her experience, that level of craft in a letter of introduction meant either a very careful man or a very deliberate one. The distinction mattered considerably. Tyler examined Louis in the study with Bethany present, which he had suggested, with smooth professional courtesy, might not be necessary. "I find the Duchess's presence useful," Louis said, in the tone that closed discussions. She sat in the chair beside the window with her notebook open and wrote down everything. Tyler's questions first, their sequence, their specific wording, the particular areas of function he chose to probe, and more instructively, the areas he did not. He was thorough on the tremors, thorough on the episodes. Less thorough, she noted, on Louis's cognitive function between episodes, a gap in clinical inquiry so counterintuitive in a physician allegedly interested in neurological disorders that it produced in the margin of her notebook a small, precise question mark. He asked Lewis about his management of the estate only once, and phrased it as a welfare inquiry rather than a functional assessment. "You must find it all rather overwhelming, Your Grace, during the more difficult periods. Not, what decisions have you made and how were they received? Not, walk me through your current responsibilities and your approach to them. But an invitation to agree that he was overwhelmed, a question shaped like a conclusion." Lewis said, "I find it manageable," and nothing more, and Bethany wrote the exchange down verbatim. The confirmation came after the examination in the corridor outside the study. She had excused herself on the pretext of instructing Mrs. Aldrin about refreshment, moved efficiently to the end of the corridor, and stood in the alcove beside the linen press, where the acoustic properties of the manor's stone walls, the same properties she had been systematically mitigating in the main rooms for 2 months, carried sound from the study doorway with startling clarity. Tyler was not alone. She had not heard a second person enter, which meant whoever it was had been waiting. The voice was low, male, and entirely familiar in its pleasant, practiced cadence. Bradley Norman said, "Well." Tyler's response was quieter, but the corridor gave her enough. Fragments assembled rapidly into a structure she recognized. Condition is progressive. The phrase episodes of increasing severity. Something about rational management of complex affairs being, in his clinical assessment, intermittent at best. The word deterioration used twice in a span she estimated at 30 seconds. Bethany stood in the alcove and wrote every word she could capture, and felt, for the first time since Bradley Norman's Thursday visit, something that was not strategic calculation. It was anger, clean and cold, the particular fury of watching a man's suffering being weaponized by people who required him broken because whole he was inconvenient. She let herself feel it for precisely the duration of the walk back to the study. Then she put it away. At dinner, Tyler was charming. He spoke knowledgeably about recent publications in neurological medicine, recommended 2 texts she had already read, and expressed with convincing warmth his hope that his assessment would be of genuine assistance to the Duke and Duchess of Blackpool. Bethany agreed that she hoped so too, and refilled his wine with her own hand, and smiled at him with the composed pleasantness of a woman who had absolutely nothing to hide and every reason to be gracious. After he left, she went directly to the library, opened the clinical journal to a fresh page, and wrote the date, the time, and a single heading at the top. Dr. Elliot Tyler, qualifications, associations, and the specific language of a compromised assessment. Then she began the work of dismantling him. She found the document on her desk on a Monday morning. It was placed with the particular deliberateness she had come to associate with Lewis at his most precise, centered exactly, parallel to the desk's edge, weighted at the top corner with the small obsidian paperweight she had relocated from the mantelpiece 3 months ago because its placement there had been producing a reflective disturbance in the study's lamplight. He had remembered this. He had used it. The detail was so characteristically him that she almost missed, for a full 3 seconds, what the document actually was. A writ of annulment, fully prepared, requiring only her signature. She sat down, read it twice, then she set it aside and opened her clinical journal and wrote the date and weather conditions with her usual precision and stared at what she had written until the letters resolved back into meaning. She found him in the east corridor at 7 in the morning, which was late for him, evidence in itself that he had not slept. He was standing at the window that overlooked the kitchen garden, the one that admitted the tolerable morning light he had mentioned on the night she had catalogued him from a library ladder and begun, without fully acknowledging it, to understand him. He did not turn when she entered. She had noticed early in their arrangement that he rarely turned to face a room's entrance, preferring, she had theorized, to complete the sensory assessment of his current environment before adding a new variable. She had stopped reading it as avoidance months ago. She stood beside him at the window and looked at the kitchen garden, which was grey and orderly in the November morning, and said, "Explain your reasoning." A long pause. "Bradley files the competency petition on Friday. Once that process begins, your position in this house becomes legally complicated. Your testimony will be characterized as the self-interested account of a wife protecting a fortune she married into." He paused again. "An annulment filed before Friday removes you from the proceedings entirely. Your name is clean. Your family's situation improves rather than deteriorates. You leave with what you came with, and whatever portion of the Blackpool accounts I can legitimately transfer before the courts freeze them." She considered this. "And your assessment of your own chances without my documentation?" The silence was its own answer. 30%, he said finally. 40 with favorable judicial appointment. "And with my testimony and the clinical journal?" He turned from the window then. She met his gaze directly, as she always did, because she had decided very early that looking away from Louis Ashford was a form of dishonesty she was not willing to practice. His expression was the stripped architectural thing it became when he had removed every layer that wasn't structurally necessary, no performance, no careful management of how he was perceived, just the truth of a man who had spent 6 years building walls and was now, with evident difficulty, standing on the wrong side of one.
"Higher," he said, "considerably. Then the arithmetic is straightforward." "The arithmetic," he said, with a precision that told her he had been rehearsing this, "does not account for what happens to you if we lose. A duchess attached to a committed duke is a woman whose judgment has been formally questioned by association. Your credibility, your prospects, every door that marriage opened. Louis." She said his name with the same flat signal quality she had used on the night of the first tremor, the register that cut through noise to reach the thing beneath it. He stopped. "I am going to say something, and I need you to hear it as information rather than sentiment, because I find sentiment imprecise, and I mean this with complete accuracy." He waited. "I did not stay in this house because I had nowhere else to go. I had, as you have correctly identified, options. Reduced options, constrained options, options that would have required considerable reconstruction of the life I had anticipated, but options." She held his gaze steadily. "I stayed because what we have built here is the only arrangement in my 20 years of existence in which my mind has been treated as an asset rather than an inconvenience. You chose me for my intelligence. You have spent 4 months consulting it, challenging it, building something functional and significant alongside it." She paused. "You are now asking me to abandon it to a 30% probability and a clean name. I find that a poor exchange." The morning light from the kitchen garden window lay quietly between them. "You should be afraid," he said. Not a warning, an honest observation, the kind he made when he trusted her enough for accuracy over comfort. "I have fear," she said. "I also have 6 months of documented medical evidence, a compromised physician whose London associations I have spent 3 weeks mapping, and a complete record of estate management conducted by a man whose cognitive function I have measured against a graduated clinical scale and found entirely unimpeachable." She picked up the annulment writ from where she had set it beside the window and held it between them. "This is a generous document. It reflects well on your character. But I did not come to Blackpool Manor to be protected from it." She set it back on the sill. "I came to be useful." Louis looked at the document, then at her. "We will need to begin preparing your testimony," he said finally. "I began preparing it in October," she said. "I've been waiting for you to catch up." The drawing-room had been her choice,
Bradley Norman's solicitor, a Mr. Gerald Ryan, had proposed the Manor's formal dining hall for the competency hearing, a room designed, she suspected, with some psychological deliberateness. The dining hall was vast, acoustically punishing, its high ceilings and bare stone walls producing precisely the compound sensory environment most likely to compromise Lewis during extended proceedings. It was, in its way, an elegant tactical suggestion, the kind that announced itself as administrative convenience while functioning as sabotage. She had countered with the drawing-room. It was smaller, better proportioned, its walls hung with the Flemish wall tapestries she had retrieved from storage 8 months ago. The light from its south-facing windows was steady and diffuse. She had arranged the seating herself the previous evening, Lewis's chair positioned with its back to the window, eliminating the variable of shifting afternoon light, her own chair beside and fractionally forward, which was not the arrangement of a supportive wife, but of a partner prepared to lead. The judicial appointee, a Lord Commissioner Hale, who had the careful, weathered expression of a man who had presided over enough proceedings to have exhausted his capacity for surprise, occupied the chair at the room's center. Bradley Norman and Mr. Ryan sat opposite. Bethany had placed their chairs 3 inches closer to the fireplace than comfort strictly warranted. The room would be warm before the proceedings concluded. Warm rooms produced a particular quality of mental fatigue in men who preferred to think of themselves as in command of their environment. She had thought of everything she could think. Then she had thought again. Ryan opened with the medical assessment. He was good, she acknowledged this privately, as one acknowledges the quality of an opposing argument without conceding its validity. He presented Tyler's report with the measured, sorrowful cadence of a man reluctantly delivering difficult truths in service of a vulnerable family's legitimate concern. The language was carefully chosen. Episodes of escalating severity, unpredictable in onset, demonstrably disruptive to consistent estate management, raising reasonable questions regarding the Duke's sustained capacity to protect the Blackpool interests and those dependent upon them. He did not say mad. He was far too careful to say mad. He said capacity and consistency and the welfare of the title, and let the space between the words do the work that the words themselves were too visible to perform. Lord Commissioner Hale listened with the expression of a man reserving judgment while assembling it simultaneously. Bradley Norman sat beside his solicitor with the practiced concern of a man who had been rehearsing it since October. When Ryan finished, Hale looked at Bethany. She stood. She did not begin with the clinical journal. This was deliberate. Beginning with her strongest evidence was the instinct of someone who needed to establish credibility. She did not need to establish credibility. She needed to dismantle Tyler's before she replaced it with her own, and dismantling required sequence. She began with the references. Dr. Hargreaves of London, whose letter of introduction had recommended Tyler with such immaculate construction, had published extensively on neurological disorders in the preceding decade. She had read every paper. She invited Lord Commissioner Hale to note that Tyler's assessment of Lewis used 3 specific phrases: intermittent rational function, progressive cognitive interference, diminished executive capacity, that appeared verbatim in a Hargreaves paper from 1809, not paraphrased, verbatim. She placed both documents before Hale with the dated clinical precision of a woman who had been building this case since November and had never once doubted she would be standing here to present it. She then placed before him the record of Tyler's corridor conversation with Bradley Norman. Not characterized, not interpreted, transcribed, timed, and witnessed by Mrs. Aldrin, whom she had positioned in the linen press alcove upon Tyler's arrival, because she had understood from the moment of his 2-second hesitation in the entrance hall that she would eventually require a corroborating witness. Ryan objected. Hale overruled him with the efficiency of a man who found the objection less interesting than the evidence. Then she opened the clinical journal. She presented it methodically. 6 months of dated, structured, meteorologically cross-referenced observations. The graduated scale, its methodology explained in terms that invited engagement rather than deference. The cognitive output measurements, Lewis's documented analytical work produced during and immediately following episodes, laid beside Tyler's claim of diminished executive capacity with the quiet, devastating patience of evidence that required no advocacy because it constituted its own. She presented the estate ledgers showing consistent, improving management under Lewis's direction, the tenancy renegotiations completed and productive, the agricultural modifications implemented and yielding measurable results in their first season, the correspondence records, the financial accounts, the complete, documented portrait of a man running a complex estate with methodical intelligence while managing a neurological condition that his physician, his compromised, pre-scripted, verbatim borrowing physician, had characterized as incapacitating. She sat down. The drawing room was by then quite warm. Lord Commissioner Hale deliberated for 22 minutes. She knew because she counted them.
When he returned his finding, the petition dismissed, the dukedom confirmed, Tyler's assessment formally noted as procedurally irregular and referred for professional review, Bradley Norman's face performed a sequence of emotions too quickly for any of them to fully settle. Ryan gathered his documents with the controlled efficiency of a man converting defeat into administrative procedure. Neither of them looked at her directly. She noted this. Lewis stood beside her as the room emptied with the particular stillness of a man who had arrived at the far side of something enormous and had not yet taken full inventory of the terrain. When only Hale remained, exchanging brief, formal courtesies before his departure, Lewis's hand found hers at her side. Not a gesture for the room, there was no one left to perform for. Simply a hand finding another hand, with the quiet precision of a man who had decided something and acted on it without requiring a speech. She turned her hand and held his. When Hale's carriage had departed and the manor had settled back into its particular silence, the good silence, the earned silence, the silence of a house that had been fought for and kept, Lewis turned to face her fully, which he did not always do, and which she had therefore learned to receive as its own form of statement. "You counted Tyler's references against Hargreaves from memory," he said. "I read everything," she said, as she had told him once in a library ladder in what felt now like a different chapter of a story she was only beginning to understand the shape of. "Yes," said the Duke of Blackpool, looking at his Duchess with the expression she had been cataloguing since November and had finally, this morning, correctly classified. "You do." Outside Blackpool Manor, the village would construct whatever story it found most satisfying. It would find different words for her now, not strange or cold or dangerously educated, but other words, newer ones, drawn from the same impulse to contain what it could not comfortably categorize. Inside it, two people who have each been discarded for the crime of thinking too precisely stood in a warm drawing-room in the late afternoon light and held the ground they had taken together. It was, Bethany decided, sufficient. It was, in fact, everything. Thanks for being part of their journey and listening to the end. I hope you enjoyed the story. You can check out more interesting stories by clicking the tabs on your screen.